Thank you, David. And thank you everyone for joining us, but especially thank you so much, Lucie, for agreeing to take part in this conversation. And it's really kind of special to me that you've taken part in, that you've agreed to be part of this. I've been sort of following this satellite project for, I think, something like 3 years or so now. I think it must be that, mustn't it? When I sort of first started thinking about satellites, and you were there right from the start. So I kind of had this moment where I was working a lot with satellite imagery, and I realized that I kind of internalized the satellite viewpoint, and I wasn't thinking about the satellites themselves. And then I started to think about this enormous sort of constellation of hardware and power dynamics, sort of national commercial power struggles and things going on up there in space, and how important they were, increasingly important they were to our lives, and how at the same time unnoticed they were. And that kind of asymmetrical power balance was really kind of, was a very interesting one. So I guess I came to you with a kind of very open question of, like, how can I have a kind of a new sort of relationship with a satellite? How can I kind of see or talk to a satellite? So yeah, that was, and yeah, I remember, you were so helpful. You gave me such great advice. And we've sort of started a conversation which has continued to this day.
Yeah, and it was really interesting to have your perspectives brought in, because obviously working with satellites on a daily basis, working in an environment where instruments are built for those satellites, and then going to companies where they build the satellite body and they put the instruments on board and then they get launched. I have a kind of both a scientific relationship with the satellites, but we do kind of anthropomorphize them at the same time as well, because we take so many years working on the development of them, or at least the engineers that I work with do. And then the element that you bring in is additional again, and that's really exciting to someone like me to be able to hear your thoughts and opinions.
I mean, that's an interesting kind of summary there, because I think for me the whole sort of satellite interest, or what I'm looking at, it's a sort of combination of that kind of scientific kind of interest in it as an area of political power, an area sort of for sort of social critique, and but also there's like the kind of, in a way, like you're sort of anthropomorphizing, there's a kind of also an area of wonder, and we've kind of, I'd like to kind of, hopefully we're going to be able to talk about both of these during the course of this conversation. But yeah, it's just such an important area, but it's also so hard to think about, and for people like us, so hard to think about, so hard to see, so hard to understand. And it's also an area where it seems to me, kind of coming into it as a complete novice, outsider, non-engineer, a kind of strange, just a really strange area, a kind of Wild West in a way, where kind of crazy, sort of violent, mysterious, uncanny activity, sort of messy stuff is concealed behind a very cool, calm scientific language. So the way that satellites are talked about is very, very technical, very acronym heavy, but behind that is just a strange world, which I kind of sort of found out more and more as I sort of started to, in the conversations we had, and I kind of started to unpick and try and understand for myself what was actually going on up there. But I think it would be really nice if we could start. I know you've prepared kind of a few slide as a kind of like satellites 101. It's like, what is going on out there in near space? And that would be a really nice framing for this conversation, I think.
Yeah, so thank you, Nye. I wanted to, sort of help the conversation by just placing in people's minds where the satellites are, what's up there beyond satellites, what is orbiting above our heads that, as you say, is really hard to sort of connect with directly. What kind of orbits do we use? Why do we use them? And basically what's up there. And I wanted to sort of give a sense of the fact that there are different altitudes that the satellites will be put into above the surface of the Earth, different types of orbits, starting from ones quite low down, relatively low down. So, for example, like the International Space Station, which is orbiting a few hundred kilometers above our heads. So that's in so-called low Earth orbit. And the space station is going round at 17,500 miles an hour. And I'm mixing my units here slightly. So in low Earth orbit, it probably takes around 90 minutes to do one orbit around the Earth. And several of our scientific satellites are in that kind of orbit. And that's just kind of the best one. It's helpful for those particular observations. So that's fairly low down. But actually, there's also orbits which are at higher altitudes. So there are orbits that are called geosynchronous orbits, and they are regions around the Earth, sort of 30,000 kilometers and up, where if you place your satellite there, it will do one orbit around the Earth in 24 hours. So you can then use that really to kind of place your satellite and be able to have it rotate at the same rate as the Earth, which is super helpful if you want to have, constant contact, for example, with your satellite, if it's beaming down, some kind of communications to the Earth, satellite TV or whatever it is. So there's a whole range of altitudes. And then it's sort of worth thinking about the fact that then means you've got satellites in low Earth orbit, which are just kind of skimming the very top of the Earth's atmosphere, where there is still some material. And that will interact with the satellites and can affect the orbit. And then you've got satellites in the geosynchronous orbits, which are way above the atmosphere, and they're not interacting with any of the particles at all. And then I like on this slide, we've got the orbit of the moon at 384,000 kilometers away. So it just kind of gives that sense of scale that actually some of our orbits are a long, long way from the surface of the Earth. And I wanted to, so this is a bit wordy, but I just wanted to use this as an opportunity to sort of talk about what is up there. And the European Space Agency has a really good website, which I took this information directly from, actually, and the link is in the following slides. So there's a lot of stuff. From my point of view, I'm working with satellites, whole satellites, operational satellites, which are there doing their job. For me, looking out into the universe, taking their scientific data. For colleagues, it might be Earth observation, looking down at the Earth, monitoring climate change, for example. So you've got the objects up there which are functional, operational satellites. But then you've got bits that might come off the satellites, like covers for maybe some kind of telescope on board. Astronauts have dropped tools in the past, and they are now in orbit around the Earth. You've got objects that are up there because maybe there was an explosion or a collision, and that does happen, even though it happens rarely, but you can create a large number of objects through that. You can have bits of the rockets that were used to launch the satellite in the first place left in orbit around the Earth. So bits of engines, bits of rocket body, and so on. And again, then with the rocket body, you can have the debris if there's an explosion associated with that as well. So there's lots of different kinds of objects up there, and some of them might be more surprising, like thinking about if an astronaut has dropped a spanner or whatever it was they were using on their spacewalk to do work on the space station. But I think the reason why it's so important to have this kind of conversation and the work that you're doing, Nye, is because the number of objects in orbit around the Earth is going up dramatically. And you can see here, this is from the European Space Agency website, so going all the way back to the start of the space age in the 1950s, end of the 1950s. This plot is color coded then by those different types of objects. But you can see in the dark blue and the light blue, the number of objects which are either, you know, operational satellites or debris from defunct satellites is going up, and it's going up quite markedly, and the collective number over time. So we've got, you know, thousands and thousands of large objects in orbit around the Earth, but this is, you know, not just the operational satellites that you might be looking for and wanting to, you know, connect with in the project, but the space debris as well. And the reason why there is this kind of big jump in the number of objects, the number of satellites being launched, is that where there's been a sort of change in the type of orbit that's used. So especially on the commercial side, these satellites, which are at a very high altitude in the geosynchronous orbit that would be used for communication, that orbit is almost being overtaken by a lower orbit, the low Earth orbit, where the spacecraft are only a few hundred kilometers up, because companies have realized that you can put satellites in that orbit and provide services like broadband all around the world. And that has been enabled by cheaper access to space, but also smaller satellites that are now being built, which feeds into this cheaper access. So you can see that this low Earth orbit, number of objects in low Earth orbit has really risen over time. So this would include, for example, the Starlink, SpaceX Starlink satellites, which lots of people will have heard about. That's one of the mega constellations in low Earth orbit. 12,000 satellites when the project is up and running fully, which will be connecting people around the world, giving broadband internet services. So this different use of space is really happening fast, and it's happening in a kind of very poorly regulated way. So there's not much control. You have to have a license to launch these satellites, but what that license covers is quite minimal. And so it doesn't cover whether you're going to be causing light pollution for people who are enjoying the night sky, because suddenly you can see thousands of satellites. It doesn't cover the impact it has on astrophysics and astronomers who are using, you know, wide field images to take observations that are now getting crisscrossed by the satellites. And then just a note to say that, okay, we put stuff up, we should have a responsibility to make sure that when it's no longer operational, that stuff comes down or gets pushed out into a sufficiently far away orbit that it's not going to cause a problem for collisions and creating space debris. So this plot here shows the number of objects re-entering. So if you are in low Earth orbit, skimming the top of the Earth's atmosphere, satellites will feel a drag depending on where they are, and then they can start to deorbit. And so there's a slight, or there is a trend in deorbiting number with the solar cycle. So this is the activity levels of our sun, which dumps a load of energy in the Earth's atmosphere in this cyclical 10-year cycle. When lots of energy is dumped into the atmosphere, it expands up over the spacecraft in low Earth orbit, and they start to deorbit. So the deorbiting will happen naturally. And then the issue is, will things fragment and burn up and not cause a problem landing on inhabited areas on the Earth? So that's a kind of very quick whistle-stop introduction to the numbers that are up there, and the fact that there are things that are really useful that we want for science, we want for society, but there's a lot of space debris up there as well. So I think I'll stop sharing now.
That was super interesting, Lucie. Thank you. I've got a few sort of images around the things that you talked about. Let me see, shall I just share? Also, I wanted to ask really quickly, where is the, you hear about decommissioned satellites being dropped into a graveyard orbit. Is it just one single orbit, or is it just different for every satellite? Is there like a band decommissioned
Yeah.
satellites in a graveyard orbit?
So that's pushing them sufficiently far away that they are then able to be very spread out. I don't actually know the range of distances that would involve. I mean, it must be beyond the geosynchronous orbit, but then you would have a very low probability of collision. And if you did, the collision wouldn't interfere with the useful orbits. So that kind of minimizes that risk. And at really far distances, because you won't have atmospheric drag acting on your objects, they won't start to spiral in and come into an inner orbit. So you push them sufficiently far out. Yeah, but I can't remember the distance from the Earth that they go into. To be able to do that, though, you need remaining fuel on your satellite. So there's also that issue that you might have best made plans to responsibly end your satellite's life, but if the satellite stops working, which they will do, activity of the sun will also affect that. The charged particles that come out from the sun can damage the satellites, make them inoperable. So that you need kind of a really robust and solid plan for what you're going to do with your satellites.
I mean, just sort of coming back to that, you're talking about the sort of pollution or the use of the sky. I have here a diagram of, because one of the first things I wondered when I started looking at satellites is how many are over my head right now. And the answer to that question is something like this. If you are in Llandudno right now, where Mostyn Gallery is, I'm not sure I've got them all, but you are, at least that number of satellites is over your head. And I think when I first discovered that, it was way more than I had expected. And actually this is color coded based on how old things are. So you can see there's still some really, really old pieces from like the 1970s. But coming back to your space debris thing, I don't know, some of you might have seen this extraordinary image from New South Wales from, I think it was in the last month, where this piece of SpaceX, I guess, rocket body, or actually they don't know it's SpaceX, do they? I'm not sure if anybody's actually claimed it yet, but this piece of debris has fallen. It's obviously fallen hard enough to embed itself in the ground. But it's just such an extraordinary image. It's like a kind of a monolith, isn't it? I would sort of love this image I found earlier of another piece of space debris. This is just such a kind of beautiful object in a way. So I guess this is one which is really, it's presumably small enough to burn up in the atmosphere. So it's just sort of an aluminium oxide slag. But that issue you were talking about the responsible deorbiting. Obviously, there's been quite in the last sort of maybe in 6 months, have there been two big sort of somewhat uncontrolled deorbiting of the Chinese Long March rocket body, where basically they're kind of, as I understand it, they're hitting the atmosphere and nobody really knows where they're going to land. They're going to land somewhere on the trajectory of that around the Earth, but nobody kind of really knows. And the kind of safety procedures around that appear to be mainly, well, the Earth is mainly ocean, so the chances are it will land in the sea. But yeah, that's kind of, so this is here are pieces of the long body just sort of coming back down to the atmosphere, sorry, the Long March. And here's actually a rocket body. Yeah, I mean, as you say, when I first started looking at satellites, I had no idea how, I kind of thought, okay, satellites up there. I hadn't really given much thought, I have to admit, to how they got up there. I don't know, I thought they flew or something. but hadn't occurred to me sort of that they went up there and then that the mechanism for getting them up there was still up in space. And it was a kind of really surprising realization when I realized that the R/B next to lots of the satellites that I was looking at actually stood for rocket body. But this is one of the, I think this is one of the bigger ones. So this is one, and there's lots of them. So when you're looking at your kind of satellite list, you see them orbiting, and I was like, how is the same one orbiting all the time? But in fact, there's lots of them, aren't there? Because presumably there's lots of, they use the same series of rocket body for multiple payloads. But this one here, BSL-16RB, or I think it's a hangover from the Cold War. The Russian name is the Zenit 2. So it's a Russian rocket body, and it's about 4 by 12 meters of sort of uncontrolled metal just tumbling in the atmosphere, presumably in lower Earth orbit. And there's lots of them, aren't there? I think they're also, some of them are also they're radioactive, aren't they? In some cases, there's kind of fuel left.
Yeah, so there could be toxic fuel left on the rockets, and I know one bit of space debris that we did recover came from a satellite that was launched on the first Ariane 5 rocket, which is the European Space Agency launcher. That was back in 1996, and there was a software error actually on the software of the rocket. And so it had to be destroyed about a minute and a half after launch. Right. And our scientific instruments came raining back down to Earth and they were retrieved from a swamp, and they've all got toxic rocket fuel on, so we can't handle them without wearing gloves. So
right. Wow.
That was the cluster mission. So yes, space debris of the kind that we didn't want, because that destroyed that version of the mission. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, how serious an issue is this now? I mean, I know there's a thing, is it called the Kessler syndrome? Or about the idea that, enough particles start to bombard it or start to break up?
So, because once you start to create more space debris that is all circling in an orbit, if you have other space debris that's in orbits that cross, then you can have more collisions and this kind of, rapidly growing number of particles of the destroyed objects, and then increasing your likelihood of further collisions and further space debris. And I mean, it is an issue. So, for example, there is a Japanese mission that we work on called Hinode, and we have a telescope on board. It was launched back in 2006. But the orbit it's in has a lot of space debris in it caused by a collision of two spacecraft. And so there are times when the operators in Japan will need to just sort of be monitoring carefully and carrying out sort of collision avoidance maneuvers to make sure that the telescope remains safe. So small bits of debris even don't enter the telescope, puncture the filters on the telescope, cause any problems. So it is an issue, and again, with the kind of increasing number of spacecraft in low Earth orbit, how you do that collision avoidance, because atmospheric effects can change the altitude of the orbit and then the time that the satellite is taking to go around the Earth, and it might bring it into the path of another satellite. So how do you do that for thousands and thousands of satellites? You can't do it in a manual way. So you need to develop automated systems. And it might be between, this company and that company, or this space agency and that space agency. So how do you make sure you are sufficiently well coordinated? So this growing number and the changing number of actors who are launching the satellites with different motivations, they might be okay with losing a certain number of satellites. That might be part of their model, but it's not okay if that then creates a lot of space debris that impacts on other users of that space. So it is a serious conversation.
Because there's also been I mean, I guess it's been happening for a while, hasn't it? But sort of more publicly, a number of nations actually blowing up their own satellites as a kind of, I guess, as a sort of proof that they can. So there's been a couple in the last couple of years, haven't there? So we're sort of either through missiles from the ground or through sort of explosions or the satellite itself exploding.
Yeah, and again, and this isn't a new thing. The destruction of satellites by nations to test that technology. Again, I remember another case being told to me by a colleague. There was a solar physics satellite, and I think it was called Solwind, some number in the series. And they apparently were only told, a couple of days beforehand that was the target of an anti-satellite test, and it was blown up. I think that was back in the 1980s. But again, you do it today, the consequences could be much more severe. But that was an American satellite. And so there's kind of early adopters of those technologies were able to do it in an environment where people weren't so closely monitoring, and it wouldn't perhaps have so much impact. Now new players are coming in, they want to do the same thing, but there's not the kind of governance in place to make sure that the risks to the use of space in general is kept really low.
And that is an interesting thing, isn't it, about the governance. Basically, it seems, as you say, it's kind of individual countries regulate activities, but internationally, it's quite patchy.
Yeah, and so there is nobody has ever been held to account for something that's happened in space. And I mean, I'm not an expert in that area, but I don't hear that, there is this sufficient governance and a body that would oversee that, especially given you've got more businesses working in space, you've got more national space agencies using space. So that's why I think that public pressure is really important. There's two sort of things that come to mind. One is about who owns space. Well, I would say everybody owns space, so it should be there for everybody, not just for scientists like myself who want to put satellites up to do science, or for businesses who want to generate jobs and make money and have an economic impact, but really for everybody. But then there's another aspect, which is that the night sky, so that visual, what we see in the night sky, who owns the night sky. And again, I would say that's everybody, whether you're in a nation that's taking part in space activities in a very strong way or maybe not. So there's this kind of responsible and sustainable use of space needs people's input. What is it that people are happy with, and what is it that we're not happy with? Do we want, and it's an interesting question, you're going to be organising satellite viewing opportunities. I know you're going to talk about that at the end. But where is the line between an interesting night sky where you are picking out some satellites and it's really fascinating to see, and you see the space station going over and you think, oh, there's astronauts on there, versus a night sky that is polluted with satellites? And I think we're in need of having that conversation before it's too late, before it's irreversible. Because once we get that infrastructure up there, businesses are developed, people on the earth are using it, what kind of level of say can we have at that point?
Yeah, I think that public conversation thing is really interesting, and as you say, it's super important. But it's kind of an area sort of coming from outside. Again, as a non-engineer, it's very hard to engage with. I spent a couple of years just trying to work out what on earth all the things you're talking about mean, and my knowledge is still very, very rudimentary, and there's also, it seems there's a fairly high level, it seems, of kind of gatekeeping. I don't know, some of it obviously is just baseline because it is, these are scientifically difficult concepts, But there's also, so to an extent, it seems like some of it may be a deliberate gatekeeping. I remember us having a conversation a while back about Trevor Paglen's was it orbital reflector, and so he wanted to launch this satellite, and I think it had an end of life plan. It was going to rotate for a circle orbit for a year and then just sort of burn up in the atmosphere. And I remember reading articles about it in sort of engineering journals. People were so angry. They were so angry that that an artist should be engaging in this space. And so angry that they could be kind of, that an artist will be polluting it and stopping scientists doing their jobs. I don't know. That's a kind of very broad question, but I mean, to what extent, I suppose, do you think there is a kind of conscious level of gatekeeping compared to somebody like you, who is a keen communicator who really wants to have this conversation with people and get people involved in helping to shape these decisions?
It was really interesting to me to hear colleagues basically saying our use of space is appropriate and your use of space is not appropriate. And I was kind of shocked, actually, because I thought I operated in a realm of equity and excitement about space and wanting to share that. I suppose the people who speak loudest might not be representative of the majority. But yeah, you're right, that did feel like gatekeeping, and it felt like a kind of privilege that no, we're allowed to basically exploit it for our purposes, but other people with other ideas and other perspectives can't. And I worry that there are companies that will basically do that now as well, act as the gatekeepers, especially around these low Earth orbits, because they're saying no, our businesses are really important. And I'm not saying they're not, because they're creating jobs, they're creating economic return, and if they can get an appropriate model going, then it could give people access to broadband internet that otherwise is not possible through ground infrastructure. There's still a lot of argument or discussion about the fact it's expensive, and so it's not really meeting the needs of the people who need it. But I suppose as things go on, costs come down, maybe it will eventually. But they're saying, we're going to be very responsible and about our use of low Earth orbit, and we're going to be sustainable in our approach. I went to a discussion between two companies that are launching into these orbits for internet services. And they were saying, well, it doesn't, it's not in our own interest to pollute that part of space by creating lots of space debris. So you can trust us to act responsibly and be sustainable.
Self-regulating.
Yeah, that's right. I'm not sure that I really want to take your word for it. It's not for you to have the only say. Other people should be inputting to that, and so there has been some dialogue, I think actually quite a lot of dialogue with astronomers, astrophysicists, about, as I said at the start, not sort of polluting the night sky with lots of satellites crisscrossing it, by not taking up too much of the sort of radio wavelength bands, because people observe the universe using radio waves. But there's not been that, they still are saying, no, we're going to do this. You're not really able to influence too much what we're going to do. But the public voice is not coming yet. And I think in the UK, there's an interesting opportunity to have a say through, there's an all-party parliamentary group on dark skies. And so they're very much focused on light pollution. So what lighting regulations are needed, I don't know, sports pitches, common lighting at night, whatever it is. So they're about protecting dark skies. And there are different places around the country which are sort of designated dark sky sites. And they're looking to see what policies do we need to bring in to keep, you know, some of the country's dark sky sites, because it's so important for our inspiration, culture, heritage. But I think that group should also be tackling light pollution from satellites. So there could be an opportunity for people to write to their MP, you know, and ask, are you a member of this group? And if so, what are you doing? And have you thought about uses of space as part of that, as part of their remit? And, you know, maybe initially the answer will be no, but if enough people write, then that might start to get MPs thinking about, okay, well, if this isn't the vehicle to do that, what might be? And the UK Space Agency is the body within the UK as well that's then going to be overseeing launches from UK ground. So maybe it would be down in Cornwall, maybe it would be up in Scotland, but looking at regulations around UK launches. So there are potentially ways, but I do agree with you, Nye, is a lot out there, and it is it's a lot to take on board. So finding somewhere, I'd be keen to hear people's thoughts and your thoughts about how we could better do that.
Yeah, it is, because I guess it kind of brings me on to the kind of something I want to talk, which is about you know, what role art could play in something like this. Or what, you know, what is there a space, or how can art operate in this space? Because I know that you've worked with other artists and creatives in the past. It's sort of an interesting potential mechanism to kind of engage the general public.
Yeah,
but a very indirect one. But I wondered if you might just sort of speak a little bit about the how you've worked with artists and creatives in the past.
Yeah, and I think that my sort of perspective has been very much about drawing out relationships and discussions and conversations on a kind of equal footing. So in terms of kind of, you know, my sector, academia and public engagement, it's been easy, I think, for people in academia to sort of think, oh, we're generating knowledge through our research, we should share that. So the kind of person over here has got knowledge and they're going to give it to the person over here who doesn't have the knowledge. And that, you know, is an important model, because we're making science discoveries. We want to make sure that that information has a societal benefit. But there's also, you know, there should be a closed circle, because how do you know you're doing the right research if you don't talk to communities to make sure that you are going to be able to meet their needs? And so I'm interested in the impact on the scientists and engineers, as well as the impact on the public audience. And that public audience, of course, can be really varied and has sort of multiple components. So I've been interested in using art as a way to get those conversations on an equal footing. So there was one really nice event we did, it was a long time ago now, run by an artist called Joanna Griffin, which was a storytelling event all about space. And she came and had a residency in our department and talked to people and met people in the local area and got their views about our space lab and so on. And it kind of culminated in this really lovely storytelling event where people gathered in the grounds of the department we have. So we're in this unusual situation where we work in a Victorian mansion. That's our space science laboratory, and we've got lots of ground around it. And so at sunset, we walked through the grounds and we just stopped off at different points. You know, maybe there was a fire pit, or we had an African drummer, and people just shared their experiences, not knowledge, but feelings, interests, experiences. And that was, I think, a kind of moment of reflection for people I work with, to think about how do we engage and how do we sort of connect on a human level. And that's kind of similar in the poetry that we did with Simon Barraclough. So I think in a way it's about, shared discussion, and it's about having the scientists and engineers understand what different people in the public think and feel and want, so that we're not the gatekeepers, but that actually we can sort of be more representative. And it is kind of hard in space, especially space research, because it's so abstract. How would we use information from the public in our black hole research, for example? But this use of space overall is a really good way to have a kind of productive relationship. So I don't know, so lots of things swirling around my mind, but we work a lot with the European Space Agency, the Japanese Space Agency, even the Chinese Space Agency. And, we wouldn't necessarily have any influence in the latter ones, but with the European Space Agency, maybe we could sort of feed in public views in the committees we're on, the decisions that are made. And I think the European Space Agency does have some really good plans for sustainable, ethical uses of space to make sure that what we send up comes down or is repurposed, reused, recycled. This kind of, they're talking about a circular economy in space now. So I've kind of waffled a bit there, but I think it's important to use the art collaborations to get different perspectives and to open up everybody's eyes and minds about the use of space.
Yeah, that's really interesting, but also interesting what you were talking about, Joanne Griffin's piece about, which was focused on the sort of human experience. From my kind of perspective, and I'm really interested in the idea of taking stuff across domains. You can take a kind of conversation which is sort of quite established in one domain, but is perhaps something really new in another domain. And I think that can be a really powerful thing to do. It's something I kind of it's a way I sort of worked in the past when I did my backdoors project on compromised surveillance cameras. It was taking an Internet of Things conversation from the kind of engineering world into an art space. And with my commission, I'm kind of trying again to sort of do this domain porting, which I think is a really interesting thing. But it's quite it's an interesting challenge artistically, because the science is so solid and it's so there that I find myself, what I have to do is I'm kind of scratching away at the gaps, the sort of spaces between things, in order to kind of find the kind of material, or to kind of find a way in, which is a way to talk about these things without just being really, really direct. So that's kind of, that's sort of trying to sort of find a different route, a different perspective, just trying to kind of tease something out. And the thing that I've kind of got really interested in as I've been kind of doing this research is this sort of idea of these decommissioned, these ghost satellites, which is really what this residency is about. And it sort of started when I sort of first started watching the satellites going overhead. And I started sort of trying to work out what they were. And I realized that the one that I've been watching, which I'd chosen just because I like the name, it's called ISIS. And then I realized that it was actually almost exactly the same age as me. And it was kind of actually one of the sort of probably one of the oldest objects in orbit, which is still in some way sending some kind of signal. But it was just like, with a kind of moment of shock, with that kind of the realization that something has been up there for so long and is still doing something. But it is sort of something about there's a couple of things. There's that kind of the idea with these decommissioned satellites, when they they're important, valuable machinery, and then suddenly they're decommissioned, and then they're something else. They're kind of debris, but there's like, they could almost even be art objects. And the idea of this kind of afterlife that they have, which could be, it could be a few years, it could be hundreds of years, as these kind of unseen or almost unseeable, undetectable objects just orbiting around the Earth, and the fact that you can kind of only contact them in a kind of in a sort of seance-like activity by sort of that sort of act of setting up a ground station and trying to communicate with them. It is very much, it is quite seance-like, but just that strange, they just enter this kind of strange unknowable sort of space. It's like, philosophically, what are they anymore, and what are they doing? And that was the kind of basis for what I was sort of working on, was the idea of a kind of speculative narrative about how what are they doing in their afterlife. And actually that's the sort of inspiration for the title of the project, which is The Time Before the Fire. So what are they actually, what's happening to them in those sort of unseen years, centuries before they kind of hit the atmosphere and burn up. And just the idea of these objects. And I think, as you were talking about right at the beginning, this sort of idea of anthropomorphizing, it's kind of hard not to. But these strange objects, which were once oars in the ground and then formed and then sent up to space, and they kind of, they are still forever trapped in Earth orbit, however close it is, and only able to kind of orbit and look down until the kind of end where maybe they finally return to Earth. And there's something quite kind of strange and poetic about that. I'm just thinking, I've got let me just hold a second. Oh, actually, and I wanted to, we've got quickly time. I wanted to just show people some pictures of some really early satellites. As part of this thing, I've been researching old decommissioned satellites, and they're just really interesting objects. So these are, I think, Sputnik's first satellite, I think, correct me if I say something wrong, Lucie, Vanguard, first US satellite. And I think, isn't Vanguard is now the oldest object still in orbit around the Earth. And they're tiny things, these things. I think Vanguard is like the size of an orange. And then there's these amazing looking objects from the sort of late 60s, early 70s. And I find it really interesting as objects, because I guess when they were being designed, the designers didn't really know too much about what a satellite could be or what it could do, because they seem to be very much kind of reflecting a kind of idea of popular culture. At the time, there's sort of something very kind of UFO-y about it. And there's also a kind of, there seems to me to be a deliberate sort of designed aesthetic.
Yeah, and I think those early ones were spinning. That gives stability to the satellite. So this kind of cylindrical shape, and with the solar panels all the way around, means that as it's spinning, it's always getting energy from the sun.
Yes, I see. And I think this is the oldest Russian satellite still in orbit. But it's interesting as well, isn't it? Because clearly, you can see they're following a completely different design path. Obviously, they weren't talking to each other at the time with the solar panels out there. But I find that they're really interesting objects, because I guess they were also they were like prestige projects, weren't they? So they would be sort of reproduced on postcards, they were on stamps, they were so the look of them, I think, had some kind of importance to the prestige of the project. And I mean, it's a slightly left field question, but when you build a satellite now, so when you build like the solar orbiter, is there any thought at all to the aesthetics of the design, or is it all purely functional, and the kind of prestige communication aspect around it is all around the data?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and that's not one I would ever have thought to have asked the engineers who designed the spacecraft. So for Solar Orbiter, that's the latest European Space Agency mission to study the sun. That's in orbit around the sun at the moment, and spacecraft itself was supplied by Airbus. And they tend to look like cubes now, with sort of two arms that have got the solar panels coming out that allow you to charge your batteries and provide energy for the spacecraft. So as far as I know, it's purely functional, that you are looking to and there's a heritage, so you don't necessarily design a totally new kind of spacecraft on which you put your instruments. You would say, okay, well, the heritage would be this spacecraft which has been used before, and maybe it's tweaked this way and that way, and that gives you more reliability, because you don't want to be just kind of making new stuff each time. That would give a risk. But I was thinking back to the Rosetta mission, ESA's mission to a comet, when you were talking about, you know, the anthropomorphization. And I remember all the cartoons where they kind of turned it into this character, the spacecraft into a character. And even though there may not be a design aesthetic in there, it might be purely functional. I don't know, there still kind of is, in a implicit and unintended way. Especially with the kind of solar panels like arms. I don't know, but I think the answer, I've never asked that question, and that shows the beauty of just bringing different people together. I will certainly ask it next time I get a chance to.
No, sorry to interrupt, but we're just approaching 6:57 now, so I just wondered if you wanted to take the conversation just to its end. That's all right.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Thanks, David. So we didn't I know I didn't get to talk about all the things we wanted to. I guess it was inevitable, wasn't it? We were trying to cover so much. But I wanted to, the sort of next event of this commission, this project, is I am inviting people to a kind of mass satellite gazing event. So it's like a star watching event, but you're going to be looking for satellites. And it will be taking place next Tuesday, 23rd of August, because that's actually, it's a new moon, and so it's going to be, the skies will be quite dark, so it's a good time for star watching. So you should be able to go out into your garden or your local park or whatever, and you should be able to look up, and you should actually be able to see some of the satellites with the naked eye. So in the there's a guide that I produced, which is on the website, and I've got a list of all of the satellites that you may well be able, that are passing over, and you may well be able to see with the naked eye. It's quite a kind of interesting, it's quite an interesting collection actually, because I think there's about 30 or 40 that you might get a chance to see, and most of them are, or a high proportion of them, are rocket bodies. I guess perhaps it's because the brightest things in the sky are also in low Earth orbit. I don't know, but then the rest, there's decommissioned satellites, and in fact of the sort of 40, only 2 of them are actually active satellites, and one of them is a suspected electronic intelligence, sort of, well, it's suspected purposes to gather electronic information, electronic intelligence. So that's kind of quite an interesting thing to watch going over your head. So anyway, I hope that people will just take the opportunity just to go out and look up, you know, or you can just forget about the satellite guide and actually just looking up and watching the satellites is also kind of wonderful. I mean, coming back to what we were saying earlier, Lucie, that kind of the sort of hard science, this is what's happening geopolitically, and then that kind of also that kind of sense of wonder that I think, you know, you kind of can't help feeling.
I mean, it is, and it's nice to know what you're looking at as it goes over, because quite often I go out and I'm looking up, and if it's the space station, it's obvious because it's so bright, but if it's other satellites, I'm always thinking, what are those satellites? And maybe I could just sort of say a word that links back to someone's question they asked about, do all the satellites orbit in the same direction? So they, in an answer, kind of yes, you can have satellites in polar orbit that are going over the north and south poles, but as you look at the sky, you might get a sort of sense of crisscrossing, but satellites are all mostly launched in the direction of the Earth's spin, which gives the satellite a bit of a kick. You get a sort of free bit of velocity from the spin of the Earth. But have a look for that when you see them going overhead. How are they moving? Are they all moving clearly in the same way, or is it more of a, so something to look out for?